These trees are more than just the pride of Tasmania's forests. They are the pride of Australia.
Being amongst big trees is utterly humbling.
The good news? We may have saved this champion tree and its forest.
This is Brand Tasmania. This is something we can all be proud of.
This is my religion. These trees deserve to live.
For the last decade, I've been travelling to the world's most iconic mountain bike destinations. So I know Tasmania has all the essential elements, like mountains, forests, and clean rivers that's needed to truly become a world-class destination for the entire sport. But add into that mix the biggest trees in the Southern Hemisphere, and us Tasmanians have something truly unique.
I remember my parents taking me into the bush when I was just a little kid. And I guess that being in the forest has always been what I've done. They taught me to look up and listen to the birdsong, to look down for orchid species, and to identify all the types of plants and animals that most people might just walk past.
When I was a kid in California, I remember how proud everyone was of our giant forest redwood trees. They're internationally famous and they're legendary. They've taken hold of people's imaginations around the world. When I moved to Tasmania, it was as a scientist to study the treetops and the biodiversity of these giant eucalyptus trees. Tasmania is legendary. It's known to botanists and enthusiasts around the world as one of the most important hotspots for champion trees.
I've always been inspired by wild places and driven to explore them. I'm lucky to have turned that inspiration into a career. As a marine biologist, I have been dwarfed by melting ice caps and giant whales. The first time I swam beside one of the largest living creatures on Earth, wide-eyed and bubbling away, it changed me forever. It's this love of wild places that led me to start exploring Tasmania's forests.
The reason I do tree work is because I love trees. I did my apprenticeship in horticulture in the Royal Botanic Gardens, Sydney. I learnt from experts in their fields, but I hadn't really found what I loved yet. In my last year there, I saw some arborists pruning some huge Moreton Bay figs. I pretty much signed up for the course the next day.
As my young kids get older, there will be fewer and fewer of these giant old trees left anywhere in the world. I'm motivated to show them as much as I can of these spectacular ultimate forests.
Although, do you know what? That treehouse isn't as good as we can make it. We're going to make a good treehouse that has walls.
Here in Tasmania, we have the Southern Hemisphere's tallest and largest trees. These are groves of colossal flowering forests on a scale rivaling anything, anywhere on Earth. Yet for some reason, here in Tasmania, we don't fully capitalize on these world-famous trees. There's clearly untapped potential to share these trees with the wider world, and the wider world is very keen to meet them. But these forests have a critical and ongoing role to play in our future. Not only are these some of the most carbon-dense and fastest-growing forests in the entire world, they're also important and unique laboratories and classrooms for kids and adults. It's complicated by the fact that the largest trees of today are in the later phases of their 500-year-old life. And today, we don't have much 200, 300, or 400-year-old forest reserved on the landscape. When you approach one of these giant old trees, you can read the story of their long life in their gnarled shapes and their twisted growth patterns. You can think of them like senior citizens in our own human societies. Somehow they've survived all the challenges that life has thrown at them over the years. The climate crisis is completely upending all of our ideas of what the future is going to bring. I think there must be some lessons we can learn from these centuries-old survivors: how to be patient, how to be resilient, and how to adapt.
Nobody goes mountain biking on the city streets. Bikers want to be out in these places because the sport and the landscape are linked. If we Tasmanians are going to economise the environment, then building mountain bike trails provides such a wide range of perpetually sustainable uses for such a small impact. Once we're done building the trails, 99% of the forest ecosystems are still intact and functioning as normal. The Derby Bike Park in northern Tasmania is a ridiculous economic success story. Last year alone, it attracted 30,000 visitors and brought in more than $30 million to a very small regional community. Native forest clearfelling like this is debilitating. It's extractive and at best a very short-term economic benefit with a very long-term environmental impact. This landscape is absolutely ruined for at least the next 30 years, and you don't have to be a genius to see that. Mountain biking is a perfect example of both financial and environmental sustainability that can benefit all parts of our communities. But looking out at this, a burnt out clearfell right at the beginning of the Styx Valley Tourist Road just seems totally crazy. This patch of hillside should be full of giant trees and yellowtail black cockatoos. Getting to know a patch of forest with hundreds of massive tall trees right near the bike park, then seeing firsthand its destruction, is what has inspired me to do something. It was personal. It's not even hard to find big trees that are about to get logged. The next patch of forest, just up the road from here, is where I found 3 trees over 5 metres wide.
Every arborist has to cut trees down, and that's definitely a part of it. But that's not why I do it. I'm into looking after trees. A lot of an arborist's job is about educating people on the value of their trees. This job is a perfect example of that. The homeowners got me in to remove this tree, but I was able to convince them of the value of retaining it for its habitat values. This entire area was a temperate rainforest and wet sclerophyll forest, stands of giant trees everywhere. Today there are just islands of old growth, tiny patches of remnant big trees in between clear fells and regrowth. It might be hard to imagine, but 100 metres from this clear fell is the tallest tree in the southern hemisphere, Centurion. You would think this place would be loved and respected, a national park or World Heritage listed, but just have a look at it. We're going in today to see how Centurion's recovering after the 2019 bushfires. When the fires come through this eucalypt regrowth, this so-called buffer did nothing to slow the fire down. If anything, it would have gained intensity coming through here. With the forest around it destroyed and the increased exposure to strong westerly winds, the odds are stacked against it. These places are ancient and unique and need to be respected and looked after. We need to rethink the way we look at forests as something to be protected for what they are, not something to be exploited or for people to gain something from.
Day to day, I'm out there making sure the rules are being followed as a marine environmental consultant. My work applies the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Act, or the EPBC Act. The EPBC is a federal government act that is specifically there to protect biodiversity and the environment. Prior to a development being approved, the developer must conduct an environmental impact assessment. Extensive ecological surveys are conducted so any potential impacts on threatened species can be minimised or entirely removed. For example, if important habitat structures like giant kelp forests are found, the plans will be altered to ensure that there is minimal impact. The whole proposed development is often moved to an area without such important ecological features. In the 5 years I've worked as a marine environmental consultant, I've never seen the scale of this impact in the marine space. How is this not a significant unavoidable impact? What legal mechanism allows this to happen when every other industry has to abide by the federal laws? When I look at this landscape scale destruction, I cannot understand how this is allowed to happen, especially given the restrictions in the marine space and EPBC regulations. The forestry industry is the only industry that the EPBC Act does not apply to. The federal law that everyone else has to abide by is not being applied here. Why? The Tasmanian forestry industry is totally exempt from the environmental assessments under the EPBC Act because of what's called the Regional Forest Agreement, or the RFA. The Tasmanian State RFA allows this to happen. It removes the federal EPBC Act protections, which every other industry has to follow. Effectively, it's like every construction trade: electricians, builders, brickies, carpenters, all having to follow the government regulations, than plumbers just being able to operate under an entirely different set of laws. As someone who works with the EPBC Act day to day, this is simply horrifying.
Where I grew up in southern Victoria was home to some of the tallest and biggest trees in the world. Historical records have trees at 130 metres high, well higher than anything in the US, and 30 metres taller than any tree we have in Australia today. But now, Victoria has only 2% of its old growth forest remaining. Yeah, I love big tree hunting in Tasmania because it's one of the few pursuits left today where there is a very real chance of discovering something previously unknown. Anyone can go and do this. These trees are on public land and you don't need to have a PhD to wrap a tape around a tree. For me, there's a sense of urgency. The reality is these absolute whoppers need to be found, recognised and protected before they are cut down. And you have to realise that the majority of Tasmanian big tree forests have already been logged. It's obvious to anyone actually out here in these forests that the forestry industry is not actively looking for giant trees before they log our forests. Sustainable Timber Tasmania has a giant tree policy. but it's not a binding document. There's no legal enforceability or accountability. The policy states that any tree over 85 metres tall or containing over 280 cubic metres of wood will be reserved from harvesting, with a 100 metre buffer. But, for reference, the biggest tree in Victoria only contains 234 cubic metres of wood, 46 cubic metres less than the Sustainable Timber Tasmania limit. In other words, if Victoria's biggest trees were in Tasmania, they could be logged. The official definition of a giant tree in Tasmania is astronomical and protects only 114 trees, according to Sustainable Timber Tasmania's own data as of August 2020. And then there's the problem of logging everything 84.9 metres tall and under, basically wiping out the next generation of giants. I don't think people realise that only protecting the very biggest, oldest trees that fit the numbers excludes every other tree of significance. Our oldest and gnarliest trees have characteristics far beyond their size. They have such an incredible structural complexity. Snapped, broken tops from the wild weather. Hollow, rotted out bases, so big you could park your car in. Gigantic twin trunks, bizarre, twisting formations, and branches bigger than any tree you'll find in the city. Yet, because they're under 85 metres or 280 cubic metres, they're deemed worthless to our culture. Worthless to our identity as Tasmanians. Even trees like this one are scheduled to be logged.
This tree was Australia's biggest tree, at 367 cubic metres. That's 100 cubic metres greater than Centurion. In the 2019 fires, 15 of the top 25 biggest trees in the Southern Hemisphere were lost down here. It must be hard for you to imagine what that means if you've never been into a forest like this. But it's a terrible loss. It's absolutely devastating.
The Andromeda Grove is one of the ultimate forest locations on Earth. This small area of forest is the tallest known stand of flowering plants anywhere on the planet. For international tree enthusiasts, this is the place they want to know about. There are more trees over 90 meters tall here than anywhere outside of California. This right here is the global hotspot. When I first came to Tasmania, the tallest known flowering plant was easily accessed on a clear road leading to a beautiful viewing platform right here in the Andromeda Grove. Yet today, the road's been pretty much overgrown, and there are signs in both directions instructing tourists away from this publicly owned nature reserve. When another, even taller tree was found just down the hill, it turns out there was also an old sign showing its height in feet. It had just been forgotten over the years. Tourist regions around the world can only dream of such treasures, and yet here in Tasmania, we're losing giant tree destinations faster than we're building them. In New Zealand, Japan, Western Australia, India, the USA, and elsewhere, entire regions of countries are famous for their giant trees, and dozens, hundreds, thousands of tourism businesses are built up around them. As Tasmania's international profile has grown, it's become very clear to me that there are people clamoring to meet our giant trees, and yet they have few ways to experience them. These trees are authentic symbols of place. They're underutilized assets for regional tourism, artisanal, and educational enterprises. Places like the Huon Valley and the Derwent Valley have these globally significant landmark forests, but only minimal established opportunities for people to visit and understand them. Tasmania used to have an interagency Giant Trees Consultative Committee with a stated mission to promote tourism, but that group hasn't met for at least a decade. Tasmania has a perfect opportunity to really get out in front of the global interest in our giant trees. These ancient forests could be at the forefront of our current pivot to sustainable tourism. This is brand Tasmania. This is something we can all be proud of.
This is Charon. It's the first big tree along the Styx Valley Tourist Road, and it's like 20 metres from the road. It's so old and gnarly, but it and two other giant trees over 5 metres wide are scheduled to be logged in this area this year. Knowing that these ancient, giant trees are about to be destroyed, you can't help but want to do something about it. So I've teamed up with Forestry Watch. I guess that doing it this way, doing the detailed survey work, is not confrontational. I'm not an activist locking myself to the logging machines. I'm just out here taking a look around this piece of forest.
No, I had no idea what we'd found. We just followed a forestry road to this logging area and went in for a look. Big trees were absolutely everywhere. Well, at least we thought they were big until we found this one. We wrapped a measuring tape around it and we found it was more than 17 metres in circumference. This really didn't mean anything to me at this point, other than it was really, really big. So I consulted the Tasmanian Big Tree Register and learnt that this tree right here is either the biggest or second biggest of its species. But we could hear the logging machines. And it's about to be cut down. It was so clear now that this tree was next to go. As soon as I got home, I jumped online to check a great public resource, the Natural Valleys Atlas, something I do every day for work. It was incredible. Not only did we discover this incredibly significant tree in this logging area, but we found that the entire logging area sits on what is listed in the Natural Valleys Atlas as a globally significant geoconservation area. It wasn't even hard work. It took 5 minutes. So I don't know exactly what happened in their planning process. All of this indicated to me that this tree and forest should not be impacted, both in my experience as a marine environmental consultant and as a young Tasmanian that cares for our wild places. The good news? Within a week of posting this online, the machines had stopped work, and within a fortnight, they were entirely out of the forest. We may have saved this champion tree and its forest.
It's pretty obvious that old growth logging is still a thing here in Tassie, and that giant trees do get logged. They have lived for hundreds of years and made it through all of the storms to still be here, standing today. I'm super proud to have played a part in highlighting what was about to happen to these giant trees on the Styx Valley Tourist Drive, because these giant trees are a fundamental part of this forest's complexity. They are the icons of our forests, and through them we can all learn to be engaged with the forest in ways that fulfil each of us. I wasn't engaged, but my experiences of just spending time amongst them working and writing, and then seeing firsthand the destruction that goes on behind locked forestry gates, has given me the resolve to keep searching, to keep hunting for more giant trees.
Being amongst big trees is utterly humbling. You might be familiar with looking up at the stars and feeling small. This reminder of our tiny place in the universe is absolutely fundamental to our sense of being and place. I think being humbled by nature might remind a lot of people that so much of modern life is just fluff. For sure, I'm here for the trees. I'd personally rather leave them alone, keep them secret. Unfortunately, that's not really an option in 2021. These forests are my home now, and as long as we're still losing old growth and big trees, I'm prepared to find them and do what I can to protect them.
Every time I take clients out on a giant tree expedition, I'm stunned by the excitement and delight it brings them. It sparks joy. Meeting these ancient trees is a life-changing experience, and people are willing to pay for guidance and interpretation. Tasmania is a much more famous destination than when I first came here 20 years ago. We've now got a chance to tell our international admirers a remarkable story of spectacular forests. I believe these trees can contribute to our quiet pursuits of the extraordinary in tourism, fine arts, filmmaking, literature, and agriculture. It can really support Tasmania's branding on the mainland and overseas. There's been a lot of debate over society's responsibilities to these ancient forests. But Tasmanians should realize these giant trees left standing are truly unique economic opportunities for all of Tasmania.
I got a call from Forestry Watch. They told me about this huge tree they found in a logging area. They reckon it's a giant, so I thought I'd give it a climb to measure it. There's definitely a risk factor getting into big trees like this. For sure I get scared, but that's a big part of it, and you really have to earn these climbs. I'm always really conscious and respectful in the way I climb these trees. I love climbing these old trees. It's definitely not a macho type experience. There's no room for ego up here. When you're sitting up here, it's a humbling experience. It's spiritual. One. This is my religion. These trees deserve to live.